Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live at pghcitypaper.com. Email your questions and comments to Lynn at pghcitypaper.com.
Good morning, folks. It's not Lynn Cullen, as you can tell. You hear my dulcet tones. It's number 2 on Thursday. Lynn is preparing for her Lynn Cullen's Wild Ride, which is going to be her show on Monday evening at the Pittsburgh Cabaret, the cabaret which is in the ground floor of the O'Reilly Theater downtown. I believe there's still some tickets available. This is going to be a benefit for the Planned Parenthood of Western PA, which Lynn is a great proponent, and I hope you can make it, because I'm sure either if you've heard some of her wilder stories before, you'll love to hear them again. It's like those family stories that you tell at Christmas over and over and over again. But also it's a great, especially in these conservative times, as we've now have our Congress turning much, much, much towards the conservative side, beginning at the beginning of 2015. So it will be a good show. And I saw Lynn on Tuesday, and she's all revved up about it. And maybe she's listening to us. So if you're out there, Lynn, just keep erasing and keep editing with that blue pencil. I wasn't sure what to talk about today. I had a few ideas to bringing people in, but it didn't work out. At one point, I thought of just looking at silly things in the newspaper, like today in the Times, in the sports section. And I'm one of those people, as you may remember from listening to me on this program a number of times with Lynn on the other side. I'm always the distaff side about sports. But I always look for things like scandals, or sports people being thrown off the team because they're rapists or child molesters or what have you, or other kind of sillinesses like that. But today, there's a funny article which I'll just mention, I won't go into, but it's called, in the New York Times sports section, "Busting a Barrier, Preserving the Seams, Jeans Makers Help Hard-to-Fit Athletes." And what arrested me when looking through the Times sports section quickly was not the title of this article by Zach Schönbrunn, but rather the legs of 3 men who were German track cyclists who have legs like Braunschweiger sausages. And the whole point of this is they showed a picture there also below this rather gross picture of Beth Newell, a national cycling champion, that she could not find jeans that she could wear. And we see her, and her legs don't look so sausagey as the male Germans above. We hope so. But then we see her in jeans, another picture right next to her. And can you believe this? I mean, I am very much a proponent of Kickstarter. But there are times, maybe "but" is an interesting word to use with 2 T's, because she proposed and raised $68,000 on Kickstarter to launch Kieran cut jeans. So if you have big thighs, no matter what your whether you're male or female, I suppose you can go and give more money to that specific cause. But I think, isn't the world wonderful when we should be worrying about food, poverty, miscegenation, childhood, molestation? We're worried about fat thighs and whether our legs look good in this age of skinny jeans. Well, enough of that for the moment. Since I'm not going to be here in early December, I'm going to be out of New York, so you can weep bitter tears for that already in anticipation of that. I thought I would talk about something that's really sort of near and dear to my heart. I suppose it's my own kind of Lynn Cullen's wild ride. In my case, this was initiated by personal interest and personal biography, but has had implications for the last 25 years. And what I'm talking about is on the 1st of December of this year, 2014, it will be the 25th iteration of the commemoration of World AIDS Day, which was set the previous year, in the middle of the previous year, by the World Health Organization. That was at a time when, those of you who are old enough to remember, was when we first started getting notations in newspapers, a little bit on TV, of the AIDS crisis when no one exactly knew how infection occurred. I remember a funny commercial with Dick Cavett on TV. It was one of the first paid advertisements, PSA, for showing you that he said toilet seats do not cause AIDS, and he threw the toilet seat over his shoulder and hit someone on the head, and he said, but it does cause concussions, et cetera, et cetera. And a long article just very soon after that in the Village Voice listing the 10 most egregious falsehoods about the AIDS crisis contagion. But basically what happened and how it comes back to Tom Sokolowski now 25 years later in Western Pennsylvania, that just on that day, I happened to be in London in '89. And when I was in London, I remember the pages of, as I said, the first iteration of World AIDS Day. I saw in the Guardian, the Independent, the Standard, the Times of London, they all had, if not a headline, certainly the headline, whatever that's called in newspaper parlance, talking about the numbers that were by then becoming astronomical. I mean, they seemed paltry by today's numerical standards for the AIDS crisis of deaths as well as continuing contagion all over the world. Even reoccurrences, I mean, the numbers going far up even in the United States, where people should certainly know better in most communities. And it just struck me that all there were these statistics, 8,000 here and 5,000 more, and epidemiologists suggesting that in the next year that would be quintupled, et cetera, et cetera. And I got back home and I thought, since this disease, although not exclusively, but was hitting a lot of a couple of my communities, my demographic communities. One, the LGBT community, the gay community, as it was then called, as well as the arts community, because many people in both of those areas, those demographic components, were becoming ill and were dying. And I remember very soon afterwards, there was an article, I think it was an issue of Time magazine or Newsweek, and it was something like The Losses of Our World. And it was 2 or 3 pages of whichever journal that was, weekly, and they literally had postage stamp figures of 100 people who had died of AIDS, and they were, for obvious reasons, to make the point of this article, they were well-known people, and many of them were actors, choreographers, musicians, poets, etc. I mean, there were some sports figures, and there were some politicians, etc. Very few, and maybe I'm wrong about that, maybe no politicians. That would seem to be correct. And it just struck me that it was all about, death and terror and loss. And on the one level, that's something that did strike people, but it was also frightening. So a group of people met in my apartment with the temptation of my fabulous cooking, and there were 4 people in the art world, and I said, well, what can we do about this? And none of us were epidemiologists or medical people or benefits people in any kind of situation with respect to that. None of us were fundraisers for medical conditions, although we all had experience and really ample experience in fundraising in the arts world, in the literature and educational world. And we decided, all right, what are we going to do? So we sent out a letter to a lot of our friends in the art world. I think there was about 200. And convened at my museum at the time, the Gray Art Gallery, a meeting, I think it was in February, so February of 90, or no, of 89, that's right, and just said, hey, this is what we're seeing. And I remember I brought up the statistic that in the previous 3 weeks, this was in New York City, in the New York Times and the Village Voice, in other circulars, the Jewish Weekly, the German, blah, 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 that each of them had listed some play, These were all artistic artistic comments. These were all little stories or comments about artistic endeavors, whether it was a book about AIDS, whether it was the first play to appear on Broadway, whether it was a photographer photographing people with AIDS, whether it was a painter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or a university class being given about disease and plagues and pandemics and making comparisons. How is AIDS like the bubonic plague, and what would be the effects of those the effects of one that had happened before, and then of course what would happen in the future with the AIDS crisis. So we decided that we would start out with press, and we said, well, if we put together a press release and send it out to all of these journals as well as the New York Times and CBS and what have you, saying, look, in March of 1989, there were 30 mentions of various stripe, of events of various substance, some national, some local, some very localized, just in the bowels of Greenwich Village. Someone would take note. So we did that and got some commentary. And then about 2 months later, in our group, we started to meet every month. More people would come in. They'd hear about it, or they couldn't meet the first meeting, et cetera. We grew and grew and grew. And then, in fact, because of space, we moved on to the boardroom of MoMA because a friend and colleague there, Philip Yenowin, who was head of the education department, had a really big space, and it was MoMA. We thought that the gravitas of the Museum of Modern Art, plus meeting in the boardroom where the fannies that sat on those very louche chairs, if a chair can be louche, a grammarian can criticize me on that, that would be really sexy. We were always very smart about what will get more people through the door. You know, like they always say, coffee and donuts after. So we had the fanny issue. So our group got bigger and bigger. And at one of these meetings, we decided we would call ourselves Visual AIDS. And the idea was that what everyone talks about nowadays, you're going to give a presentation, you're going to do a PowerPoint, it's a visual aid. It's a picture is worth 1,000 words. We've all heard that adage. And people like to see a pie chart rather than just reading numbers. We visualize, we understand better. And we like that. But AIDS, it was spelled like the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. One parenthesis to that was everyone should know that it was only months before that AIDS, as we know it today, that title, if you will, was being used, because before that there were all sorts of acronyms for it because no one really knew. I remember it was I believe it was 1982, some 7 years before that, when the New York Times, in the middle of the summer, I think it was July 2nd, just before the 4th of July, when there was a little article that struck, and everyone in the gay community particularly went crazy, saying, gay cancer noticed in New York area. And already there had been thousands who had been brought into the emergency room with what turned out to be AIDS. So we started meeting and talking more and more. And then someone said, well, you know, this is not unlike our actions here in this activist groundswell, guerrilla movement, if you will, is not like what many people in the art world did back in the 1960s to respond to the Vietnam War, America's inclusion in the Vietnam War. And maybe we should look back at some of the strategies. And this one fellow, whose name evades me at the moment, hopefully I'll think about it before we go off the air, and he said, well, you know, I'm old enough, I was there. And I remember that on one Friday, in Soho, which at that point was the heart of the contemporary art world below Houston Street, Lower Manhattan, where most of the major galleries were people like Warhol and Lichtenstein and all the great artists of the 60s were showing, they hung a banner that said, "Stop the War," or something akin to that. And all of the galleries closed their doors on that day. And there was a protest march in the street, which everyone was very was much doing, whether it was pro-civil rights actions, and other sort of issues. It was, very issue-oriented times, much unlike our own. And we all said, oh, that's sort of interesting. And he said, you know what? This is what we could call it. We could call it Day Without Art. And we all thought, oh, that's pretty good. Those of us who were in the business of marketing our various institutions and wordsmiths and what have you, we said, oh, that's really good. That sounds Day Without Art. We like that. And the point was, what would happen at some point in the future if the AIDS crisis, and we can insert Ebola and things like that in our future, which we now sit in, if AIDS was allowed to spread unwatched, uninhibited, there would be no artist who'd make art, whether that be a book, a play, a piece of music, a visual object on the wall or standing in a piece of sculpture. There would be no curators to tell us what that work was. There would be no guards to guard that. There'd be no person at the information desk to take our ticket, etc. No critics to say whether that artwork, whatever form it may take, was good, bad, or indifferent, whether we should go and see it. So indeed would be a day without art. And so this would be amplified by closing the institutions. Well, now, the other part of the story that's interesting is that all of us, at this point, about 40 or 50 people were meeting in this grand boardroom of the Museum of Modern Art. And we all said, well, that's great, but it's now late 80s, and admission fees are a very, very big part of our annual budgets. And in fact, even though there may be some institutions where both management and board would agree to this in a spiritual way, in a supportive way, they may say, our museum brings in $20,000 on a weekend day, and that first Day Without Art, and I'll get to that in just one second, was going to be on a Friday. And weekend days are the biggest attendance days in most museums around the world. That's $20,000 in our budget that just goes zip. So we said, okay, 20 of us who were really directors of museums and such, we would each call before our next meeting, and we sort of said, we're going to have a meeting in 2 weeks. We'll call up 3 friends and say, will this fly at your institution? Now, let me open another parenthesis here, which is we decided, since there was always this World AIDS Day on December 1st, we in the art world, rather than creating something that would be in competition with it, would say, okay, fine, but we're going to call it Day Without Art. It's much sexier, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, close parenthesis. So we did that, and of course what happened was just what I had hinted at. Some people would say, oh, they'll let us do something, meaning the board, or in some cases the director, in the galleries, but no way are we going to be able to close the door. It's $20,000. Or that would be too audacious a statement to make in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or something of that nature. So what then happened, we came back and reported at the subsequent meeting, and what became the leitmotif of that organization of visual aids and really continues to this day, 25 years later, was the fact that what we decided to do was go back and say, okay, if you agree to participate in this, you do something. And the motif was a day without art, a day of mourning and militancy and support of people with AIDS and their caregivers, an issue that still is part of that mantra today. And I remember this was in late May, and so everyone was going off for the summer and what have you, particularly in the culture world. Everything closes down. It's very much like a semestral issue in universities. And it's this heavy breathing, which is not, I guess it's just asthmatic, not because I'm getting emotional about this, but Lynn always talks about my breathing, says that it sounds like a porn site. I should be so lucky. Let's close that parenthesis pretty damn quick. Anyway, so during the summer, I was in charge of the marketing committee, because that's one of my strong suits, I think. And so that time we sort of sent out this letter. We sent it to 1,000 cultural institutions all throughout America, and even some Canadian, where we knew we had friends there who would be interested, etc. And oddly enough, it turns out that Canadian institutions, either large or small, had a much easier time of getting some of these ideas through than their American colleagues, which I thought was very interesting. Even the National Gallery in Ottawa, I mean, in our country, one has to go through Congress to get anything done in Washington, even in one of the museums. And we would try to get people to participate, and some very soon. And I remember I made many, many hundreds of calls on Thank You NYU. That's where my museum was connected, and many hours when I was doing this rather than NYU connected work. And we basically talked to people, and in some instances, oh yeah, we've been thinking about something, and I'm glad you did this. Blah, 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 blah. So then, by the end of the summer, again, it was the summer, and I think had 30 people scheduled to participate, and we all had our first meeting after Labor Day and said, well, this is a pretty miserable turnout. So I again got on the phones with my whip, and very interestingly, it was like a tsunami had happened. All of these people started calling in, either I had called them or they heard about something, saying, oh, we want to participate. And the deal was, if you participated on this first day without art, you would be on a poster that we would produce. And the notion, again, like our idea of the press release very, very early on, in the early days of visual aids, was that it would be on this poster would be the names of every organization. So if you were the Lower Slavovian Arts League, you would be on the same poster as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it would be alphabetically. So there would be no hierarchy whatsoever. And what became very, very interesting was that with this modus that I mentioned before of saying, do something, do what's appropriate for your community. That's where the richness of basically our localities, our people involved with culture, our communities of whatever sort of demographics came out. And then writing this press release, which then by the time it finally went out in late October, I believe it was something like 7 or 8 pages long. And the reason for that was each one of these institutions did such amazingly interesting and appropriate things. So, for example, the Metropolitan Museum could not close because every day there's something like 100,000 people or whatever the number is. No, it's probably more like 40 or 50,000, but still that's a hell of a lot of people go to the Met. What they did, however, and think about this, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, probably our most august museum in this country, decided that they would take down a picture. And in its stead, it was the picture of Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein. And in its stead, there would be a placard saying, Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein has been taken down as a kind of anti-exhibition to posit to the viewer, if you are sad, angry, very angry because you've traveled from Beijing to see this one picture and it's not on view for you and you'll never come back to New York City again or the Metropolitan Museum, just think of this as a metaphor when someone perhaps who you've lost touch with has sickened and died due to the HIV virus and you'll never see them again. Think about this. And it was a very famous picture. I remember one of our members, a lesbian member of our group, said, God damn it. Well, of course, what would they do? Would they take down the picture of a dyke at the Met, which would got great humor? And a few other people noticed that, and some of the critics. But notwithstanding, it was a famous picture. So this happened. And then Gary Tinterow, who is now the director of the museum in Houston, a very impressive man, he got the education department to put huge bowls, and those of you who've been to the Metropolitan, they have this great grand hallway at the entrance, and there's a circular kind of kiosk where people sit and answer your questions and give you a brochure or a button, tell you where the bathrooms are. There were huge bowls with condoms. Now, that may happen in student unions all around the country or in, hipster bars or something, or it should. But condoms in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I mean, that was quite extraordinary. But it happened because the director of the museum, Philippe Montebello, people like Gary Tinterow, who had been in charge of European painting and sculpture for a number of years, was well respected, said, this is something the Met should be involved with. Now, in other instances, in my museum, we did a specific installation with live people. It was a performance because, of course, an exhibition had been planned that had opened in late September. We couldn't take it down. But students did a performance with an artist leading them. So if you came to see X show, you also got to participate in this. Some places closed their doors and had a placard saying something similar to the Metropolitan placard that I read to you before. In Philadelphia, they did a parade, the arts organizations did a parade with people holding umbrellas because for somehow, I don't remember why, but the umbrella was particularly a potent image used sort of in a similar thing to in New Orleans when people die, they have a band playing sort of Bourbon Street jazz kind of music to take you to your final rest. It's not sad, but it's happy. In New Orleans, they decided there was a tradition that went back to the early years of the 19th century when I think there was some flu or plague, I can't remember which one it was. And when people were dying because people were afraid, they didn't know about contagion at that point, they wouldn't go into the homes where people were sick, but you'd hang a wreath, like we would have a Christmas wreath, let's say, in modern times. This was the wreath of mourning. So there, all the houses, the museums had these wreaths of mourning. So, of course, immediately in a place like New Orleans, people would know what that meant. And in the at Harlem, where there had been a particularly difficult issue with respect to the African American community that was not so responsive in those days to gay people and homosexuality, the Studio Museum in Harlem had a evening program with a group called Afro Homo Pomos, which were these black performance artists who talked about being gay, what that meant, and about the AIDS crisis, and on and on and on. Well, by the time we had to go to press with the poster, which was in late October, we had 685 institutions across the country. And I will put in one other thing, which I probably shouldn't, but of course I will. One person who's known to Pittsburgh, but I won't mention his name. He wasn't in Pittsburgh at the time, but he was a former museum person in Pittsburgh. I called this fellow up, who was rather august museum, and we know one another, and his response to me was, "Why would we be interested in something like that? That belongs in health clinics." And I just said, "Well, you're wrong and you're a cretin," and I hung up the phone. Well, said person, just about 2 days before our poster was to go to print, I guess had heard, or he had heard that this was beginning to have a groundswell, and had talked, I guess, to some of his colleagues at other big museums across this country and was told, "Oh, we're participating, and I can't believe someone didn't say to him, 'Hey, Buster, if you're not on that, it would be like being akin to against leukemia or diabetes or something of that nature.'" And he called up, and I remember his first words were not, "Oh, we would like to participate, can we?" But it was sort of, "Can we still get on the poster?" And I just said to this person, and pardon some of you with a little lighter sensibilities, I said, "You're an asshole." But I said, "We, of course, will be inclusionary. We will include you. Let us know so we can put you on our press release." And I remember the first day without art, which was on 25 years ago, on December 1st, one of the institutions who's both director and chief curator were very supportive. We're at the Jewish Museum in New York, and they said, "Oh, we really, really want to participate, and our board is totally in concert with this. But the one thing we can't do is that at that point, the Jewish Museum, following traditional laws, that since the Sabbath occurs beginning on Friday evening, they would close the whole museum on Friday and Saturday. That's something that the Jewish Museum observed at that time. They've since changed their attendance hours, opening hours. And they said, "We really can't do this, but we'd like to do something the night before." And we said, "Hey, great. That would be a kind of kickoff." So we went up there, and I always talk about this because I'll never forget it my entire life. It was one of the great moments of my life, I think. We went to the Jewish Museum at 7:30, and what they did was the epitome of what these organizations that, what would you say, fashioned an event for their community. So one got to the institution, to their lecture hall, and on the stage in front of the dais was a huge painting by a Canadian group called General Idea. And what the General Idea had done, they often did riffs on works of art by famous artists of the time. And some of you, many of you, I'm sure you're all wonderful, literate, and art-going listeners of this program. Robert Indiana had done this one famous painting, Love, L-O-V-E, spelled out in the 4 quadrants of a painting with pop colors. Some of you, I know if you visited the Indianapolis Museum of Art, they have the big sculpture that was made, fabricated with the help of Robert Indiana. It says Love, and they made it on T-shirts and whatever. And it's been used in many, many iterations since, but at that point, the first riff was of this group General Idea, who were at one point a group of 3 gay men. And they did, instead of L-O-V-E, they did AIDS. And so that painting hung on the back wall. And throughout the entire evening, which was led by a young female rabbi, which was, again, at that point, the Jewish Museum is a very traditional organization, and that was a woman rabbi, was a very, if not audacious, but a very progressive thing to do. And she hooked up with the notion of how in the Old Testament the various books go telling how the message of from the creation and then through Moses and then through Abraham, etc., comes to our present time. Sort of the begat chapters, so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. And she talked about that from the man, we began with creation and then got to our times. And on that evening, we had the man, and I can't remember his name now, who wrote the first play that was on Broadway. He was also a Jewish man, called As Is, that had just opened to great acclaim. He spoke about his play and the difficulty getting it brought to Broadway, because we think of Broadway, we think of entertainment, even if it's going to see Othello, but it's entertainment. How do you bring AIDS to the stage? And it was still verboten. Then there was a woman who was a very wealthy Jewish woman who lived on Park Avenue, who was a woman in her early 60s perhaps. Her son had become a doctor, had specialized in HIV and epidemiological things. He himself was a gay man, and he had become ill and had died. And she talked about that, being a woman of both social and economic privilege, as well as Jewish, and what that all meant to this young man coming out, being a doctor, and himself being ill, and all of her money and influence couldn't help him. Then there was a very, very elderly old gentleman, a rabbi, who had gone through the camps during the Second World War, and he talked about the fact that how can the Jewish people, and remember he was speaking to the audience, the friends and members of the Jewish Museum, how could the Jewish people today allow to happen to people with AIDS what happened to Jews during the Second World War, when people turned their backs to them, not seeing, not knowing what was to happen. And then, of course, the latter years of the war came, and we all know the outcome of that. And then finally, this young woman we got in this begat chapter said, and such happened, and the AIDS crisis happened, and then visual AIDS happened. And I remember there was our group there, the core of it, and we all started crying. It was amazing. And then at the end, we all stood up, and one of our group was Jewish, and he said, we sang some song which was about the Jewish community coming together. It was sung in Hebrew, and everyone sung, and it was just amazing. And I remember, and I said this is going to be a sort of personal hour, my secretary who came to that meeting, and she came with her family. And I didn't actually know this at the time. She had been very helpful during all of our preparations during this moment. And she walked up to me and introduced her parents to me, and Alyssa, who was very emotional, was crying, and her makeup was, she had raccoon eyes. And she said, "Oh, Tom, this was so wonderful. I'm glad you came, and I've not shared this with you, but my brother is a hemophiliac, and he is HIV positive. So we started crying and hugging, and the mother and the father. And it was just this notion of, even what struck me so much was this fact of, we had a very open relationship at my place of work, and talked about it. And she was talking about AIDS, and she went to meetings and activists, but she never shared that because it was something that, I don't know whether it was her version or her parents' ideas. So what could happen at this cultural institution, bringing together in the grammar and syntax of its culture to say something to the AIDS crisis. So then we all got in cabs and rushed out, because there was then going to be the official opening of the Day Without Art at the Museum of Modern Art. And we got there, and there, in their, those of you who are familiar with the institution, as you know, they, in their, well, next to latest addition, there's this huge lobby with escalators that go up 6 floors. And the main floor had the dais and the piano, and all of the people were lined up in front of the dais, and then on, it was like being at the Metropolitan Opera, and all the people around these rings looking down. There must have been 2,000 people there. It was amazing. And I remember Leonard Bernstein, who was still alive, had been asked, and he created a 2-minute piece, a kind of threnody about the AIDS crisis. And the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs spoke, who I can't remember who that was at the time. It may have been Bess Meyerson, but I can't remember. And then someone spoke from the Medical Commissioner's office in New York. And it was extraordinary. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. And then, anyway, so as we were going down the taxis to this, the taxi driver was listening to WBAI, which is a very, very activist radio station in New York. And as we were going down, and 2 or 3 taxis did this with a group of 10 of us, we heard our voices, because in the previous days, WBAI had recorded almost all of us. And it just seemed, it was so extraordinary, because it seemed like the whole city was aware of Day Without Art. So the next day happened, and as I said to you, I was in charge of the press for this event. So I was on the phone all day. And at one point, and as we were getting near to the evening hour, you know, various people were calling up from this newspaper and that newspaper, and some local New York, and some, I remember I spoke to one West Coast radio station. And there were programs like Lynn's with the commentators coming in, or even one negative one who was screaming at me and what have you. But near to the end, we were getting near to, as I say, the 6 o'clock hour with national news. And then it just started like a wave, and I got a call by Alyssa, my secretary that I referred to before. She came running in and she said, Tom, this may be a hoax, but it's Walter Cronkite. I said, you know, so... Hello, Mr. Sokolowski. It was wonderful. Can we tape something? So we did. And while this was happening, Alyssa came running in again, and she said, Tom, it's Dan Rather. And I said, tell him to behold. And I remember telling my staff, and I've told this story many, many times, that never in my life again, although who knows, but I doubt, will I be able to have people of such august personality in the media like Walter Cronkite, and then can say to Dan Rather, tell Dan to hold. And he did. But what was extraordinary about that event was, this was all happening like at 4:30, 5 o'clock, because they, you know, pre-recorded all this stuff, that we all then gathered in someone's apartment, and we each had a different station. There were 4 televisions. We had PBS, ABC, NBC, and ABC. And each single one of those newscasters at 6 o'clock, national news, began with, today is a day without art. And it was so moving because, number one, and I always tell this when I speak to young people's groups today, it was something that I think the world was seeing was an extraordinary war on our communities. But also what it showed you, if you have people with dedication, with some smarts, we were just not some, wet-nosed jerks off the street, you can get something done. We were used to speaking to the New York Times on behalf of our various institutions. Many people, not me, but had grown up with fathers and uncles being presidents of banks. So we weren't cowed to call up someone in the mayor's office, etc. And look what we accomplished. I mean, it was so extraordinary as saying what the little man can do. And it was also finally, for the first time, people telling these stories. All right, we're going to take a break. That's only Act 1, but we'll be back with Act 2 in just a second.
Ideas about food. Where do they get this stuff? Like eating Brussels sprouts helps you hit home runs. And eating carrots gives you X-ray vision. It's nuts. And I honestly have no idea where my daughter got this notion that broccoli is the official food of professional ballerinas. Kids, the only reason my 4-year-old loves cantaloupe is because he's convinced it comes from the moon.
Run, small step for man, lots of potassium for mankind.
And the other day when my oldest came up to me and said, "Mom, will eating peas and carrots really help me pull off a fakey frontside ollie with a twist?" I look him in the eye and say, "It can't hurt, honey. It can't hurt."
Moms everywhere are finding creative ways to help their kids eat 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day. Get ideas, get involved, get going at letsmove.gov. Brought to you by the USDA, HHS, and the Ad Council.
BergBargains.com is your best bet for great deals in the Berg. Log on today for exclusive bargains to City Paper's Best of Pittsburgh 2014 winners, as well as discounted gift certificates to Majorca, Rumfish Grill, and Beezy's Bar. Pittsburgh's best bargains, BergBargains.com.
Welcome to today's lottery drawing. And today's winning numbers are not yours, not yours, and another number that's not yours. And the final number is not yours.
When it comes to having money, don't rely on luck. Brew your own coffee at home instead of buying that latte. Brown bag it to work instead of ordering it. Go to feedthepig.org for more free ideas on how to save. Feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the Ad Council.
Download the brand new CP HAPS app and find out what's going on in Pittsburgh. It's the fun and free app that puts the most popular events at your fingertips. Text events to 77948 to download now and register to win a $250 gift certificate to the Swickley Spa. The CP HAPS app brought to you by Pittsburgh City Paper.
You're listening to Lynn Cullen live at pghcitypaper.com. Once again, here's Lynn Cullen.
Act 2 in Day Without Art. So we all went home and celebrated and had a few drinks and this, that, and the other. And then it was Christmas and the holidays. But again, come mid-January, we thought, like, what are we going to do now? And again, I'll insert myself very personally into this because in April of that year, I was selected for grand jury. And just, again, making a small parenthesis, if you ever get the opportunity, although I don't think we have a grand jury in Pennsylvania, but if you're ever in a state where they do, it's really fascinating because it's long. You would do a month, or at least as the version in New York City, you would do a month of half day. But during that month, I think we heard 200 cases. And any lawyers can call in and correct me, but basically what a grand jury does in its various iterations around the country is you just have someone from the prosecution side present the evidence of a case, and the grand jury votes to say, well, we don't know if the guy's guilty or innocent, but there's enough information here, enough evidence to say we should look at it. And so what that tended to mean was the prosecution was usually pretty good. And I have to say, most of these assistant DAs who'd present were these young whippersnappers, but from places like Yale and Princeton and NYU and whatever, University of Pittsburgh, I'm sure. You know, they were the best and the brightest, and they were so good, and they weren't going to bring something before the grand jury if there wasn't adequate evidence. And so we heard 200 some cases, and I think of those, 196 were sent to go forth to trial. And it's very grotesque. I mean, we had child molestation, we had murders, and it was not boring. Anyway, so close parenthesis. Anyway, at the end of my time there of this month, I would take the subway down from Washington Square, where I lived, to downtown Manhattan, where the courts were, and then take the subway back up to go to my job. And I noticed that in the last week, this was, again, probably the last week of May, something like that, a bunch of old duffers, as we used to use that word. I don't know what you'd call them now. I love in Yiddish, it's alte kakas, like old shitters. But anyway, pardon me? Blue hairs, I'm hearing. We're on the subway, and I mean really working class guys, wearing caps and that, saying, so-and-so oil company and what have you. And I don't say it to belittle them by any means, so please don't misunderstand. Wearing what looked like corsages. I mean, not some little thing, but corsages of yellow ribbons. And this was at the point when the troops were coming back from the first, the war that Bush 1 had sent to, where the hell was it now? Kuwait. No. Yeah, Kuwait. Was it? Where was it? Somewhere out there. Isn't that terrible? My history is not so great. But anyway, they had come back from that first war when we had gone to the Middle East. And this was the time they were going to come, and there was going to be a ticker tape parade in Lower Manhattan, so hence the specificity of this, to welcome the troops back. And as you remember, there was that adage when the troops were away, people would tie a yellow ribbon around a tree, and that all came from that country song, tie a yellow ribbon round. And it was a way of showing people's commitment to the forces and the troops. And so, of course, the wearing of these yellow ribbons, and I believe this started through some DJ or something.
Gulf War.
The Gulf War, yes. Pardon me? 1990, the Gulf War, yes, thanks. And so this was the way to show salute for the troops. And I walked back in, I said to my staff, hey, this is sort of weird. And thinking about it, I remember we had a meeting that evening of our group for the visual aids, and I said, I told this little story, and I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if these old duffers who would never be seen wearing, a boutonniere with a rose or something as an old sort of dandies, turn of the century England or New York, I suppose, as well, or in Pittsburgh, would be willing to wear some kind of symbol that would represent sort of what Everything Day Without Art did, namely support for people with AIDS and their caregivers. So by that time, our group had really gotten very large, largely due to the success of the first Day Without Art. Everyone loves a winning team. And we had a group within that had started to grow within our numbers, which was of visual artists. And they said, and some theatrical people as well, and they said, we'd like to be, you're all arts administrators and curators, what have you, critics. We'd like to have a say and do what we do to help this issue. We said, great. So that was it. It took on the name. We loved naming everything with the Artists Caucus. And the Artists Caucus, and so I brought this story up. And they said, let us think about this. So went away. It was a month. And we came back, and at this meeting, a woman by the name of Hope Sandro, who's a marvelous artist, a photographer, lives in Long Island, and she said, this is what we came up with. And it was the twisted red ribbon that has now become ubiquitous across the world. And I remember, I always say this, to say that I'm not right all the time, and I looked at it and I said, that's kind of cheesy. But the rest of the group said, yeah, that's great. It's simple. And So we said, okay, we voted, and we were always very democratic. And we said, okay, that's what we're going to do. So then the question was, because what it is, if those of you who haven't seen, it's the exact same thing, and I'll get to that in just a level. It's the shape of the pink ribbon that is used for recognition of breast cancer. Purple one is used for diabetes. Blue, it's been taken on by many, many causes. So we were sitting there, and it was a little bit of grosgrain ribbon with a little gold safety pin. That's how you made them. And we decided then and there that we would not, and this is interesting, particularly with respect to the Susan Komen Foundation and the pink ribbon, where they have copyrighted. We decided we wouldn't do that. we may have been able to gain money from. We probably would have been able to get a ton of money. But we said, no, we want people to use it. And if they have to write to us and get permission, and we were using the metaphor. Again, people in our business were really good at the wordsmanship as well as the visual imaging in terms of the marketing. We said we wanted this image of the ribbon to be viral, just like the illness. So we sent it out. There was a little graphic you could get online. And online was just beginning to come. If we fax things, what have you. Just do it. Go get red ribbon, 2 inches of it, a gold pin, and you got it. So then we were sitting there saying, now, how are we going to put this out? And I remember I thought, the Tony Awards are coming up, May 29th, I think it was that year. If we could get people, because everyone loves what people in the media do, movie stars, etc. If we could get, Brad Pitt to wear it, that was going to be it. So then everyone thought that was a good idea, but now how are we going to get to the Tonys? Well, one of our group had a former boyfriend, and he said, well, my former boyfriend owes me. And so he called up this guy who is now head of the League of Broadway Theater Owners and whatever it was. And they still had a good relationship. And sure enough, we prepared packets. And that day before the Tonys, every single person who was either a nominee or a presenter got a ribbon. And we all got together at someone's house again to watch on TV. And sure enough, when, I was just going to lose it now. The actor Jeremy Irons, who was the host, when he walked out, he had the red ribbon on. And again, tears came down. And one of the agreements was they would not say, for various reasons, sensitivities, I suppose, what the ribbon was for. And so the program went on, and this one came out with the ribbon, that one came out. And I remember Ed, what was his name? The guy who used to be on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, who was the head of the station. What was his name? Isn't that terrible? But he came out and he said, we wear this because we care. And what was interesting was the next day, page 6, one of those ladies who writes gossip columns said, did you see that on the Tonys? I don't know what it's about, but I think it's about AIDS. Well, then the ribbon went viral. And what was very interesting, again, I hope some of you out there are activists, because what happened was Ed Asner, thanks so much. Ed Asner, beloved by many, etc. We got a group of people who were doing the ribbon, and then some people would call us and say, we're having a board meeting tomorrow, and there's 80 people. We have no one to make the ribbons. What can you do? And we at our meetings would be sitting there making these ribbons, and we'd send them to groups, at first for free, and then we'd say, well, just pay us for the materials. And then part of our group, which included me as well, were involved in another group called Artist Homeless Collective, which was a group of artists who were in certain ways disenfranchised in our society, as were the homeless. And we helped homeless women in some of the shelters. And we got the women who were used to doing needlework and that to make ribbons. And for every 2 ribbons, they got a penny. And so we provided women. They would make thousands of them. They were really good. And the monies would go to help them. This money would go to help them buy, whatever they needed, toiletries, what have you. So it was one activist group helping another, which was really wonderful. Well, that spread till now. The red ribbon is ubiquitous. It's now spawned these other things. Again, that was something that we did. People came out on this crazy little thing in my ride on the subway. We then had another event that happened 2 years later, which was someone said, wouldn't it be great on Day Without Art to have all of the buildings in New York, like the Empire State Building that have their lights on, go dark at some point at night? And someone said, we're going to call it Night Without Light. And again, playing off this, and there was a committee, and we said, okay, John, you're the Night Without Light committee. And a few months would go by, and we'd say, well, this committee, Night Without Light, well, nothing yet. 3rd month, well, we've got Mrs., the wife of the mayor at that time, David Dinkins, to be the honorary chair of our committee through some kind of social or whatever. And, of course, because it was the wife of the sitting mayor of New York City, that year we had 30 Hallmark buildings, all the bridges in New York, and all the marquees of the theaters on Broadway went dark at 7:45 and then came on at 8 o'clock. I mean, it was spectacular. There are postcards that are still done showing you darkened and then light. And it showed you, our organization spawned Actors Equity Fights AIDS, the acting community. It spawned Classical Actions, which are classical musicians supporting people in its realm with AIDS. We have Dancing for Life, which is the classical dance, and I think now it's also a popular dance as well, modern dance, doing the same thing. So it showed how once you create this model, it's absolutely extraordinary. And I bring this up today because, as I say, we have 6 minutes left, I believe. But to tell you the story about the AIDS crisis, which now sadly is coming up again, we know even in Pittsburgh, the numbers of new infection are coming up again, and they're coming up preponderantly in communities of color and in the heterosexual community. So AIDS is not just a gay disease, as used to be said, but also it's coming up particularly among young people. And the nexus between sexual experimentation as well as coming out for kids, which is easier, let's say, than it was in earlier days. But still, it's something in kids when passion takes over where your brain should be and you're not taking precautions. We have this contagion effort going up, as well as the fact that some people feel that now AIDS, because it's no longer a death sentence, but perhaps a chronic illness, if you look at the world, the first world, the world of the United States, there are people, thank God, who are still alive. I know certainly within those first few years, I knew 20, 30, 40 people who would, you'd hear that they were infected and they'd be dead in 2 weeks. Now there are people who are alive 35 years afterwards, and thank God that's happening. God love them. But because people feel it's a chronic disease, maybe akin to diabetes or leukemia, well, certainly those and many others can kill you, that let's not worry about it. And I'm here to tell you, well, that's certainly not the case. We still have to be vigilant. And I bring it up also because we're so enmeshed in Ebola at the moment that we forget about other diseases that are more on our doormat than Ebola is, that we have to be aware. And also, I think Ebola perhaps has the advantage, and that's probably a dreadful word to use, in that we see it as being from the other place. And as long as we're not treading into Africa, places with bad sanitation, bad medical coverage, etc., we're okay as long as we sequester people. And certainly I remember the time when in the mid-'80s, there were bills on Congress as well as in the CDC and places for National Health Organization that maybe there should be a closing of all gay bars and bathhouses and sequestering of people who had HIV disease. Thank God that didn't go through. But I think it's something that we need still to be aware of. The stigma maybe has faded a bit, but it's still here. But I hope also, if some of you perhaps aren't affected, touched, or feel you never will be in your home or your extended family or friends or your community or place of work, but to think about how what a few people did in New York City 25 years ago affected the world. By the time that I left the Board of Visual Aids, which was 10 years after its making, Day Without Art was being celebrated all over the world. We had a minute of silence on HBO one time. It was called Moment Without Television. We felt we touched, and from the demographic people who worked with us, we touched probably 100 or 200 million people. And this was something that started at a dinner in my apartment back in 1988. You can make a difference. You can make a difference in your locality. You can make a difference in your family. You can make a difference in your locality, at your school. You can make a difference by doing the sort of things, by voting when issues that impinge upon freedom, that will also impinge upon people who are ill or need our help or need our protection. You can do this. It's within your abilities. It's within your hands. And I hope that as we begin to get in a more difficult age, and unlike Lynn, I'm not going to throw all of the Republicans under the bus, but as times are going to get tougher, especially for issues of people who in one way or faction are not seen by those who hold on to normalcy and to the moral majority or to the center, those people are going to be more at risk, whether it's from illness or violence or even getting a school lunch, whether it's a school lunch or lunches for people who are ill and at home, for our veterans or for the aged. You can make a difference on all of these. So take this as you will, maybe for some an old goat, or what was your line, a blue-haired person? But you can make a difference. And let's hope that this December 1st, maybe you think about a little bit of what I've said, or maybe you go to one of the soup kitchens that still ministers to people with AIDS, or you call up the Pittsburgh AIDS Task Force, you can find them online or in the phone directory, and you say, what can I do today, or how can I learn more about your organization to better inform me, even if you don't have the time or the pocketbook to be able to make much of a financial difference or the time to dedicate 2 hours a week, etc., but just to enlighten yourself about the realities that many of our fellow citizenry go through on a day-to-day basis. But with that, I say, after maybe a fairly sober, but I hope uplifting performance, that talking about performances, we all want you to come to see Lynn on Monday night on the 17th, to come and see her and support Lynn, but also support Planned Parenthood. Again, look them up on the web. Tickets are available, and I think you might be able to buy tickets at the box office at the Cabaret, which is in, again, the O'Reilly Theater. I hope you have a good weekend, and we'll see you on the air next week. Bye-bye.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper, Steel City Media, and its advertisers.